My name is Lida Azim. I am the program manager for American Indivisible. Today's program will start with the report's author walking us through the report findings and major takeaways. Then we're joined by an amazing panel of experts that will help us understand the different forms of Islamophobia, how they show up in our everyday lives, and who is impacted, and most of all, what we can all do about it. This toolkit is a joint effort published by the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, American Indivisible, Western State Center, and the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. We would like to acknowledge our generous supporters whose contributions made this report possible, including the BEK Fund of the Common Council Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. So as we've all experienced in the last year and a half, we do have a few housekeeping items for this webinar. Please use the chat box to interact with us throughout the webinar. Submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and comments using the chat box. Let us know how you've experienced Islamophobia and how you're fighting it. And we'll also share resources with you throughout the program and a follow-up email after the webinar with resources you can use and share. It is now my pleasure to introduce our report's author, Azka Mahmood. Azka Mahmood is the Communication and Outreach Director at CAIR Georgia. She has a background in research, policy analysis, and social equalities. Azka Mahmood is committed to American Muslims' full and meaningful participation in society and their engagement in the political spheres. At CAIR Georgia, she manages internal and external communications, public and media relations, social media, and communication outreach. Previously, she served as a community outreach and events coordinator at CAIR Florida Northwest office and supported fundraising efforts, developed programming to promote American Muslim students' rights, and organized interfaith events to promote CAIR's vision and mission. She's also worked as an ISPU researcher and educator to support activities that create awareness about the American Muslim community and created resources to combat Islamophobia. And I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lida. I am very excited to be here today to share this toolkit. I'm going to share my screen. All right, thank you. So as you've heard, a lot of work has gone into this, and we're calling this guide the Countering and Dismantling Islamophobia Toolkit. My name is Azka Mahmood, and I'm very happy to be here to give you an overview. And I'm very excited to hear from the other partners that we have over here as well. So before we begin, I'm going to give you an overview of what my 15-minute more or less talk would be about. We're first going to talk about why we're using this toolkit or why we even developed it. Then we're going to talk about structural and private Islamophobia. We're going to talk about some of the pitfalls that we want to avoid when we're trying to counter and dismantle Islamophobia. And then, of course, we're going to go into some best practices. So why this toolkit? Most American Muslims and those that work in civil rights and social justice spaces are well aware of the prevalence of Islamophobia in our country and even indeed the world. As an example, just in 2018, in the FBI Hate Crime Statistics Report, race and ethnic origin and religious bias accounted for over 78% of all single bias incidents in 2018. So demographically, American Muslims are a religious minority. They're an ethnically diverse group. Half of them are immigrants, and a third of the community lives in poverty. So American Muslims are at a unique demographic intersection that makes them more vulnerable to hate crimes. The same 2018 FBI report showed that anti-Muslim hate crimes make up 15% of all religiously motivated incidents. It might not seem like a big number, but tellingly, the Sikh community, which is often mistaken to be Muslim, also saw hate crimes triple over 2017 and 2018. And then again, in recent weeks, the attack on a Muslim family in Canada shows us that Islamophobia is very much alive, even in seemingly safe and diverse spaces. The conversations that I want to touch upon happen because concurrently in recent years, American Muslims have taken a higher profile in society and public life, which has helped to elevate conversations on Islamophobia. It's helped to shed light on the urgent need to take action to counter anti-Muslim hate as well. And then the increased use of social media has also shaken up the traditional flow of information, events, ideas, and it exposes them before they can be distorted. So we put together this toolkit to create a resource for people who are seeking to answer the need for this action against Islamophobia. The Countering and Dismantling Islamophobia Guide is a collection of real-world resources and tried and tested ways to combat Islamophobia. So it's a collection of both the shapes and forms of Islamophobia and also the tools to fight it. Who can use this? This document is a resource for individuals and organizations alike. In this toolkit, concerned citizens, parents, neighbors, members of religious congregations, just average lay people will find tools that empower them to challenge Islamophobia in their homes, their neighborhoods, and communities. Similarly, educators, political, civic, religious, business community leaders, or even civic organizations, or literally any entity looking for guidance to fight Islamophobia can follow actionable items from this guidebook. And then interesting and important is that this toolkit is for both short-term and long-term use. In times of crisis, it can be a reactive rapid response toolkit for immediate actions. And then at the same time, it provides proactive long-term opportunities to address systemic challenges through education and coalition-oriented ideas. So let's talk about structural Islamophobia. Khalid Beydoun is a scholar of Islamophobia, and he identifies three main types of Islamophobia. He categorizes them as structural, individual, and dialectic. So we used Khalid Beydoun's classification of these three types to organize the guide. Using these categories, we're sharing tools to fight structural and private Islamophobia. And then in our definition of structural Islamophobia, we also address the dialectic Islamophobia. Structural Islamophobia presumes that Islam is just inherently violent. It suggests that Muslims are incompatible with broader society, and it embeds fear and suspicion of Muslims in national institutions. So structural Islamophobia is reflected in institutionalized anti-Muslim legislation. Then it's further perpetuated through dialectical Islamophobia through policing, bias in media representation and in the legal system, and then the use of anti-Muslim rhetoric and statements by political candidates, elected or appointed officials. So this means that state actors, including public officials and law enforcement agencies, use the legal framework to enact policies that impact Muslim communities at national, state, and even local levels. As a social institution, then the media plays its own role in recreating and perpetuating these stereotypes and prejudice. They portray Islam and Muslims as others, etc. In this toolkit, we compiled the ways structural Islamophobia is manifested. One manifestation of structural Islamophobia, as I mentioned earlier, is Islamic legislation. In the US, the Patriot Act, the Countering Violent Extremism Program, and then more recently, the Trump administration's executive order that banned Muslims' entry to the US from several Muslim majority countries are all examples of state-sanctioned targeting of Muslims as a group. Then there's also a concerted push to create anti-Sharia legislation across several states. And interestingly, such legislation doesn't only impact Muslims. So research suggests that anti-Sharia laws and other legislation that targets Muslims often goes hand in hand with efforts to create bigotry and fear of minorities at large, such as anti-immigration and voter ID legislation. And such measures suppress participation from racial and economic minorities and also limit freedoms for just all Americans across the board. In the legal system, Islamophobia shows up as bias against perpetrators who are perceived to be Muslims. ISPU research has shown that Muslim perceived perpetrators of violence are subject to more severe legal charges and up to 3 times the prison sentences as perpetrators who are not perceived to be Muslim. Then, in terms of media bias, in the media, perpetrators perceived as Muslims receive more than 7 times the media coverage compared to non-Muslim perpetrators for a similar crime. In terms of political rhetoric, in recent years, news reports have widely documented elected officials openly exhibiting Islamophobic views. Such Islamophobic and xenophobic rhetoric politicizes Muslims, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. And then, for instance, there's evidence of elected officials who've advocated to restrict admission of Syrian refugees to the US following ideologically motivated attacks elsewhere in the world, and which shows bias against an entire faith group due to the actions of a few. All of these manifestations of structural Islamophobia have a cumulative effect. Several studies have shown that most Americans do not personally know a Muslim, which allows the media and public figures to distort public opinion of Islam and Muslims. So in our guide to counter and dismantle Islamophobia, we've shared tools to fight structural Islamophobia using real-world examples. For this section of the toolkit, we have shared case studies where civic allyships have been successful. For instance, we included CAIR Washington's efforts to create a coalition and pass a faith in our state resolution that challenged anti-Sharia initiatives in Washington state. We have also collected resources to understand the anti-Sharia movement in the US. People can find resources to confront bias in the criminal justice system, resources to develop media literacy and demand unbiased media coverage, and to dispel falsehoods surrounding refugees. Now we come to private Islamophobia. So according to Khalid Beydoun, private Islamophobia is the fear, suspicion, and violent targeting of Muslims by private actors who are individuals or institutions that are acting independently of the state. Beydoun argues that policies, rhetoric, and media representations of Muslims enable and embolden private Islamophobia to unprecedented levels. In this toolkit, some manifestations of private Islamophobia that we documented are the emergence of hate groups and hate rallies, mosque opposition, anti-mosque activities, and assaults and harassment. Anti-Muslim hate groups are relatively new and have gained traction in recent years, but research has exposed a well-funded, well-organized Islamophobia network that spurs and fuels anti-Muslim activity in various spheres. Organizations such as Act for America hold anti-Muslim rallies and talks across the US in a roadshow fashion. There's anti-Muslim celebrities, and they all gin up anti-Muslim sentiments. Then there have been efforts to construct new mosques or expand existing Islamic centers have been met with hostility for many years. We're well aware of the opposition to the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. In the years since, several mosques have also suffered a similar fate. And resistance to mosques is often masked as like environmental or traffic concerns, but carries a very distinct us versus them undertone. To the extent that at times, city meetings that are held to just address zoning and permit issues are also targeted by Islamophobes. Then there have been well-documented and widespread instances of mosque vandalism across the US. Arson, hateful graffiti, and break-ins are common forms of mosque vandalism. And also in the years since the events of 9/11, assaults against Muslims have soared. As we all know too well, some incidents of anti-Muslim harassments do turn deadly. In addition to individual instances, Muslim worshippers are sometimes intimidated and harassed outside their mosques, and many mosques have reported receiving hateful voicemails and letters as well. So I'll go over some of the tools that we have compiled to counteract private Islamophobia. We have collected resources to help people to understand the depth and breadth of the Islamophobia industry and how to diminish its strength. We used case studies from across the country to share how to organize a community-wide show of support towards Muslims or host interfaith efforts to rally around the Muslim community. For example, we shared a case study on how to be an upstanding neighbor that looks at the relationship between Heart Song Church and the Memphis Islamic Center. We also included a guide on how to intervene if you see anti-Muslim harassment and if wherever it is safe to do so. And then for those who would like to develop personal relationships, we included tips on how to reach out to and connect with Muslim neighbors. When working to dismantle Islamophobia, it's not enough to have good intentions. There are some pitfalls that we must avoid so we don't inadvertently perpetuate Islamophobia. In order to respond to Islamophobia effectively, we have to realize that narratives about Islam and Muslims have to be widened. They have to be inclusive. It's important to understand that all Muslims are not newcomers to the US, and that anti-Muslim sentiment goes far beyond the security lens and the lens of women's rights. We must center the voices of Muslims, and we need to give them the space to speak for themselves. We have to learn how to be good allies from the example that American Muslim and Arab American leaders are setting for us, and we have to center their needs. We have to do our own research, and we must never ask marginalized communities to shoulder the burden of educating others. We should look at and avoid common mistakes made by interfaith allies. We have to help American Muslim women fight Islamophobia and not Islam. We should also steer clear of performative allyship, and then study success stories of collaborative efforts to fight Islamophobia. Some of the best practices that we sum up at the end of this toolkit are just a collection of the essence of the learnings. We have to learn about structural Islamophobia. We have to educate ourselves and others about Islam and Muslims, but we must use authentic sources. We must speak up against injustice and in favor of minorities, immigrants, refugees, civil and human rights. We must organize our neighbors and communities and collaborate across civic groups, cultivate interfaith allies, and hold public displays of solidarity. There is a lot more included in the toolkit than I can cover in a presentation. So, I just gave you a sneak peek. You have to just read it for yourself. So I encourage you to share it, read it, share it with others. Please join ISPU's mailing list and find the toolkit at the link on your screen. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Azka, for that. That was a great introduction. And if I wasn't a part of it, I would be looking at it right now. So you definitely convinced me. I will now ask our panelists to join us on camera as I introduce them. And I will ask for your patience because this is an amazing group of panelists as I go over their bio. So you have Dalia Majiahu. Sorry, I can't say your last name very well. Dalia, if you want to say your last name, because I just messed up.
Mogahed. That's okay.
Mogahed
is how you
Thank you. Is the director of research at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. Dalia is a former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. With John L. Esposito, she co-authored the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. President Barack Obama appointed her to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in 2009. She was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations about U.S. engagement with Muslim communities, and her 2016 TED Talk was named one of the top TED Talks that year. She's also a common expert analysis on in global media outlets and international forums. Next, I have Lindsay Schubiner, who directs Western State Center's momentum programs to counter the dangerous and sensation of white nationalism across the country. Since joining the center, she has led the development of a number of initiatives to strengthen democratic responses to organized bigotry, including a fellowship program to train new leaders, the promotion of civic resolutions condemning white nationalist activities, adapted to date by elected officials in 4 different communities, a rapid response intervention, a research tool for journalists and community leaders on anti-immigrant movement, and a robust schedule of professional and community training. Lindsay has provided commentary for PBS NewsHour, the New York Times, NPR, and the Washington Post, among others. Next up, we have Margari Aziza Hill, who is the executive director of Muslim Arc and an adjunct professor, blogger, editor, and freelance writer with articles published in How We Fight White Supremacy Time, Huffington Post, Al Jazeera English, Islamic Monthly, and Muslim Matters. She has 5 years of full-time experience working in community organizing, 5 years of experience in administration and technical writing in Silicon Valley small businesses and startups. She has over 15 years of teaching experience at various capacities, including substitute teacher, instructor, curriculum design, school policy, teacher training, as well as teaching assistant and teaching fellow. Her fellowships in organizing, nonprofit management, and policy, including Bend the Arc Community Organizing Residency, Women's Policy Institution County Fellowship, PICO National Leadership Training, and Next Generation Leaders of Colored Inland Region. She has a bachelor's degree in history and a master's in history of Middle East and Islamic Africa. She's given talks and lectures in various universities and community centers throughout the country. Last but not least is Nina Fernando, who serves as an executive director at the Shoulder to Shoulder Campaign, a multi-faith coalition of religious domination and faith-based organizations committed to dismantling anti-Muslim discrimination and violence in the United States and building a society where all are treated with dignity and respect. Previously, she worked as a Lanka Corp Fellow in Sri Lanka, supporting research on interreligious and intercultural conflict and coexistence at the International Center for Ethnic Studies, and prior to that, as a faith-rooted organizer educating, organizing, and mobilizing faith leaders to stand in solidarity with workers and immigrants. Nina is also a Sri Lankan Californian raised Catholic. Her intersectional identities have informed her work as a multi-faith community organizer, activist, vocalist, and songwriter. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Social Change through Music and Religious Studies, and she also holds a Master's in Interdisciplinary, Interreligious, and Cultural Studies. So, amazing group of panelists. I'm personally excited to hear from everyone. I personally don't know their answers, so I will go ahead and ask Dalia the next question. Why is the conversation about Islamophobia and the work to dismantle it important to the general public, and how does Islamophobia impact non-Muslims?
So thank you so much for that introduction, and to all the panelists and those who have taken time out of their busy day to join us as audiences in this important conversation. We wanted to really start by setting the stage for why people should care, even if they don't happen to be a Muslim. Because Islamophobia is a threat to every single person living in our country. And there are a number of reasons. The first is it erodes our civil liberties. The Patriot Act, it's been 20 years since the passing of the Patriot Act, and while it disproportionately impacts the lives of Muslims, it has also been used to spy on all Americans. So Islamophobia allows the government to take away everyone's civil liberties. The second thing is that it manufactures consent for terrible decisions that we later regret. And a case in point is the Iraq War. The Iraq War was a war that the public willingly accepted and supported based on lies, based on Islamophobic lies. And then now, almost 20 years later, the majority of Americans say that that war was a mistake. So Islamophobia manipulates us, the public in general, to going along with bad decisions that we later regret and are terrible for our country. The third thing is that it enables other types of bigotry. It emboldens and fuels other types of bigotry. So Islamophobia is very strongly linked to anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. So the more Islamophobia is enabled and fueled, the more these other types of bigotries and racism is also enabled and fueled. Islamophobia is also linked to support from the public at large for authoritarian policies and for violence. So it makes us all less free and less safe. And then finally, and I think, most importantly, Islamophobia is fueled by fear. And when we are afraid, on a neurological level, we are more likely to accept conformity, authoritarianism, and prejudice. And these three components, these three variables erode the very foundation of our democracy. So Islamophobia is a danger to our democracy and to our freedom, no matter what our faith background.
Perfect, thank you for that. Lindsay, I'll go ahead and ask you the next question. Can you share the importance of a tool like this toolkit on countering and dismantling Islamophobia, and where do you see it most useful?
Thank you so much. So over the past several years, right, we've seen bigoted anti-democratic movements gain even greater currency in mainstream politics. And of course, anti-Muslim bigotry is part of these movements and has risen in tandem with them, just as anti-Muslim hate violence has. If we look at the insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th, it was sort of the most obvious reflection of the threat that bigoted anti-democratic groups pose to democracy. As Dalia has talked about, in one sense, right? These anti-democratic groups have also targeted state legislatures. They've used violence and threats of violence to chill participation in the democratic process. And they've helped to create the context for rising hate violence. And I think it's important to note, too, that there wasn't a single group organizing the assault on the Capitol, but there was participation from across the spectrum of far-right groups. And similarly, we're seeing a fair amount of merging rhetoric on the far right with, Islamophobia paired with anti-LGBTQ bigotry, attacks on democracy, and a lot more. And part of what we see in this is the significant broadening of the reach of conspiracy theories like QAnon over the course of the pandemic in particular, but reaching farther back than that, which has really softened the ground for more organized bigoted movements. And conspiracy theories like this, we see them both undermining democratic institutions directly from media to government, because if we can't agree on a set of facts and reality, right? How can we have functional democratic institutions? And these conspiracy theories also serve as a vector for bigotry, really amplifying anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, among others. And we also, under the Trump administration, anti-Muslim figures were welcomed into the White House, and their priorities were reflected in national policy. We're also nearing the third anniversary of the Supreme Court's ruling to uphold the Muslim ban. And these are some really significant ways that anti-Muslim bigotry has been welcomed at the highest levels of our government, while we've also seen it in statewide fear-mongering through anti-Sharia legislation and localized hate violence. And I think, at the point we're at now, it's easy to point to the Trump administration as sort of a key source of anti-Muslim bigotry, and that's certainly true. But I think it's really important to remember that even though that anti-Muslim bigotry, promoted through organized groups and using policy both as a tool to spread bigotry and as a goal in and of itself, this didn't begin with the last administration, and it hasn't ended with it either. And if we look at where we are, right, the underlying conditions that led to this era of heightened overt bigotry, haven't changed. We're still seeing this, and so I think really importantly, the work before us is to mobilize in our communities to close political space for anti-Muslim bigotry and call on our democratic institutions and elected officials to do the same. For me, one of the most exciting things about this toolkit is the way that it outlines some of the many different ways that Islamophobia shows up and has concrete advice for communities, how they can respond, along with inspiration based on how communities have responded in the past. So at Western State Center, we talk all the time with community members who are witnessing the impact of organized bigotry in their communities and want to do something about it. But, of course, let's be honest, there can be some real barriers to speaking out and organizing against it. And I think this toolkit helps to break down some of those barriers by naming the threat and the impact of Islamophobia and clearly outlining what can be done, right? Because nothing's going to change if we don't organize against it. And it's so important for whether it's local law enforcement trainings led by anti-Muslim figures or attacks on mosques or, the kind of anti-Muslim rallies that we've seen in the past, to be met with a community response every single time that's inclusive, that's values-based, that's clearly denouncing anti-Muslim bigotry and really leading the way for others, right? Because the entire burden can't be on communities themselves. We need elected officials and democratic institutions to recognize the threat too. I think through using the toolkit, communities can help lead the way and call on those figures to do more, to more clearly denounce anti-Muslim bigotry and take action based on that. An important part of our analysis too is that anti-democratic groups often spread bigotry to build political power. So they're political actors that are thinking strategically about their organizing. And so an important part of our response has to be to close the political space for them to operate. Building a mainstream consensus against Islamophobia and other forms of bigotry can really do a huge amount to change the political terrain they're organizing on and create the context for a more equitable and inclusive community and democracy. I think that the toolkit is an incredible tool to support exactly that kind of really necessary work, especially in this moment when we have to keep up the fight. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Margari, the next question is directed to you. Can you share how structural and institutional Islamophobia shows up in our daily experiences? And what is one thing we can do to address it?
Thank you. I guess, for me, I guess I would like to kind of start with the framework that we use for at Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, right? When we are in this moment of racial reckoning and acknowledging both the the harm and the trauma and the continual impact of racism, of settler colonialism against indigenous peoples, right? Like where we're discovering, these mass graves, right? And also for anti-Black racism, right? Where we're seeing with the policing, and all the racial disparities. And so getting kind of at the core, right, of understanding both whether settler colonialism and anti-Black racism, it's important for us to understand the story, that the part that how anti-Muslim sentiment in that age of discovery was actually helped spur the transatlantic slave trade and justified the theft of non-Christian peoples, right? And so in doing the kind of solidarity work that we do at Muslim ARC, it really helps to provide that framework of understanding how white supremacy in its formative time, right? Like how it was really tied up into anti-Muslim sentiment and policies, right? That justified enslavement, that justified land theft, and how that extended to other peoples. So for the day-to-day, right, and the day-to-day struggle that we're having in whether in righting wrongs or forming solidarity from those who have been impacted by current policies, whether those are foreign policies or policies that we have in this country, it's important that we understand the kind of root causes. At the same time, it's recognizing that whether like the foreign policy does have an impact, right? Like when you have a nation that is at war, and especially with ethno-nationalism and patriotism, and when it targets particular populations, right, because of their faith practice, not just their faith, but seeing them as unacceptable human beings, right, because of how they look, right, because they're racialized as predominantly non-white, non-European, and they're Black and Asian, right, where the majority of Muslims are from, that those wars justify the targeting of people who are in that community, and specifically for Muslims. We know that Muslims first came to the United States, before it was United States, in colonies as enslaved peoples, and that there were policies that really hindered the religious practices of those enslaved Africans who were Muslim. And so the reproduction of Islam was hindered, right? But there was a growing movement of African Americans who became Muslim and critiquing white supremacy, and they did face those early communities in the 20th century who were predominantly African American and Afro-Caribbean, faced extreme surveillance, right, and repression from the state. And so that's the context that we are in now. But on the everyday level, right, and you talked about the kind of structural racism, which I think it's important for us to understand the systems, right, whether these non-state actors, they're having absolute impact on policy, whether that's school policy of making sure that Islam is not taught in schools. And so that means that also extends to our children getting bullied, right? It plays a part into job discrimination, housing discrimination. Many Muslims, if you ask people, they have faced housing discrimination, that those numbers are marked in areas like in Chicago, where you'll see, many cases, but you'll also see Muslims having subprime loans. And so it's important for us to really unpack that and understand how both the religious discrimination has an interplay with racial discrimination and how Muslims are racialized. And so I think when we're thinking about the solution, right, and I'll just kind of point back to that kind of root cause, right, is really understanding that this isn't about necessarily, and I understand like the kind of the understanding of fear of the unknown, but we have to really understand this as a form of oppression, that anti-Muslim oppression, whether we want to call it Islamophobia, if we want to call it Orientalism, if we want to call it anti-Muslim racism, that it is a form of oppression, that it's not fueled by lack of knowledge, but that there are people that specifically benefit from the oppression of Muslims, whether that's through the industry, whether that's through the defense industry or the national security system, right? Or just building a platform on hate and stirring hate. And so for us, like our main thrust, right, is building solidarity, right, is educating each other on the interplay, how we are all impacted by the system of oppression, and that we can work to create a society that is more inclusive. And that means identifying the targets, right, the who's targeted, the discourses and the policies, and working against them.
Awesome, thank you for that. Our last question before we go towards the Q&A is towards Nina. If you could share with us how Islamophobia shows in people's everyday lives and what are some actions that can be taken to address it?
Great. Thanks, everyone. So I'm sure there are many that can relate to this. Like growing up, you know, people would ask me where I was really from, just to name one example of the kinds of questions people have asked me. And there are many stories I can share. And oftentimes I'm perceived to be Muslim because of my role at Shoulder to Shoulder. When folks hear that I come from a Sri Lankan Catholic family, they might wonder, why do I do this work? Why am I committed to this issue? And for me, it comes down to the basic and inherent value of human dignity. Islamophobia is a dehumanizing campaign that impacts our psyches, how we live together, how our society functions, and it impacts real people, human beings, you and me. And unfortunately, it's been quite successful in our society. And I also believe that we have been and we can be successful in coming together to push back and poke holes and counter and dismantle it so that we can build a nation that finally lives up to its ideals of human dignity for all. Ideals that clearly have never been realized. And I think this toolkit can be helpful to get us there. And for those of you, who don't know, Shoulder to Shoulder is a multi-faith coalition-based campaign of religious denominations, faith-based and interfaith community organizations, and individual people who are committed to countering anti-Muslim discrimination here in the United States. And in many ways, it's a multi-faith ally organization. And we think of our work in three buckets. We connect, we equip, and we mobilize faith communities and people of goodwill on this issue. And what I want to highlight a bit more in this conversation is how we equip. We see that it is critical to engage faith and religious communities in this work because oftentimes it's non-Muslim faith communities who are part of perpetuating the problem. And the work of Shoulder to Shoulder is so important because our members, our network, both official and unofficial, are opting in and choosing to be a part of the solution. But we know that not everyone in our communities are on board with us. Not everyone gets it. And for those who are on board already and who do get it, maybe those of you that are joining this webinar, we also need to be trained. The choir needs practice. And so Shoulder to Shoulder, we host a training for our network called Faith Over Fear, where we walk with faith and community leaders in a 4-part training, thinking through and addressing anti-Muslim bigotry, how it makes an impact personally, what's at stake if we don't address it, what compels us to work on this issue in the first place. And then we look at understanding and contextualizing Islamophobia here in the United States. Much of what you saw in the introduction of what is Islamophobia here in this toolkit, what are the ways that it shows up in the day-to-day and conversations in the media and policies? What does the research tell us? What is the Islamophobia industry? How does Islamophobia a form of racism? And we take some time to unpack that. And then what's core and key is messaging and communicating for change. How do we talk about this effectively with folks who are bombarded with misinformation and fear about Islam and Muslims? Where do we start? How do we not reinforce negative stereotypes in our messaging? What are best practices and best tested messages that can move people? And then finally, strategies for engagement and change. What can we concretely do? What can we build and implement in our own communities to make change on this issue? And I really think this toolkit is an amazing resource for folks to use in developing strategies, what they can do. And I want to note, you're here, you're a part of this conversation now, you're exploring this toolkit because you know anti-Muslim discrimination is a problem, that it impacts not just Muslims, but those who are perceived to be Muslim. And as we heard from our panelists, it impacts all of us. And you want to be a part of making change. And I think it's important to note that you don't have to be an expert to begin this work. There are a ton of resources like this toolkit, like the organizations, like the ones that many of us serve on. There are books and videos that can help broaden your understanding, that can move you along in this work. And sometimes we highlight, in our trainings at Shoulder to Shoulder, you hold unique influence and trust in the circles and networks you're a part of. You can plant seeds of thought and conversation with your best friend or your colleague or your community better than I could, because I don't know your best friend or colleague or community. And I want to close by sharing that I got even deeper into this work when I became a mother last year. And I think about what kind of world I want my baby to grow up in. How will my baby be perceived by people who don't look and think like him? And how do I want him to engage with people who don't look and think like him? And I think it's terrifying to think about all the ways it can go wrong. And it's also this motivating call to action. What kind of example are we setting in the way we live our lives for our children and the future generations? And so I just want to invite you all to think about why this issue matters to you as you explore this toolkit, and let that be your call to action. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nina. That was a great ending to the set of questions we have for our panelists. Now we'll go ahead and transition to the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please use the bottom feature where it says Q&A to add any questions. I will pose the question if any one of you would like to answer it. If not, I will direct it towards one of you. So for the first question, it looks like there's a lot of, questions about Hindiva movement, which is promoting anti-Muslim views. So does this toolkit actually address these type of groups, or can you talk more about those groups? So if everyone wants to jump in on that.
I can go ahead and at least start. The sources of Islamophobia are plentiful, and one source that is often ignored is comes from the Hinduva kind of sort of hyper Hindu nationalism that's been growing in India, unfortunately, over the past several decades. We are considering doing a research project on that at ISPU to understand the impact. But it's important for people to understand that when we think of Islamophobia, we often think about it, coming from the majority of, American whites or something. And that is most of the time the case. It is a form of white supremacy. But there are other types of supremacies that emanate Islamophobia, and one of them is Hindu supremacy. And Muslim minorities in India have suffered tremendously, have been targeted for violence, are targeted for institutional racism based on their faith. And it's important to understand the impact of that ideology here in the United States as well.
Anyone would like to add to that? Also totally okay if no one wants to.
Yeah, I guess, I would definitely add, even thinking about white supremacy, right, is like as a form of ethno-nationalism, that's sort of like this kind of pan-nationalism, right? And thinking, like there's other forms like where we're having like with, against the Uyghur community. So, right. And that's the ethno-nationalist policies that are really targeting the Muslim community. But yeah, we're seeing that kind of impact. And I think it's important for us to think about the threat, right, of ethno-nationalism globally and how those actors are connecting transnationally. So, I mean, I'm really excited about the work that ISPU is doing to research this. It's just so important for us to research like how ethno-nationalists across different countries are actually building platforms targeting Muslim minorities.
I just want to note, that there's a unique opportunity here in the United States because of our ideals as a nation to be a religiously pluralistic nation, and we know that we have not lived up to that, and we see that all the time here. But also, if we use that as our guiding post to move people on this issue, that can be a powerful motivator.
Awesome. I think there's a question similar to the answer, so I will go ahead and skip some right now, but get back to other questions. So Islamophobia more in some parts of the United States than others. Also, does Islamophobia incident impact more certain races or gender?
I can start just by looking at our research. So we've been doing public opinion research on Islamophobia and the experiences of American Muslims every year for the past 5 years. And what we found over and over is that Islamophobia is very gendered. Muslim women consistently are more likely than Muslim men to say that they've experienced religious-based discrimination. They're also more likely to say that that they've experienced racism as well. Regardless, for some reason, this is something we don't completely understand why Muslim women are more likely to report experiencing racism than Muslim men. But for sure, religious discrimination has been an issue for Muslim women more than Muslim men. In terms of regions of the country, we don't have data on that. But when you look at within races, the folks within the Muslim community that are most targeted for Islamophobia are young people, poor people, and women. So those are the three groups that suffer the most within the Muslim community from religious-based discrimination.
So transitioning a little bit more into strategy, there was a question in the context of interfaith dialogue with communities that are minorities and who they associate themselves with. So are there any strategies to overcome blind loyalties that they can use in these situations? And let me know if there needs to be a little bit more context in this question too.
Maybe a little bit more context.
Yeah, no worries. So the question itself stated that interfaith dialogue with communities that are minorities and therefore make national allies work well until their blind support for oppressive countries and regimes are exposed. So how do you have any strategies to overcome these blind loyalties? So I'm assuming the question is, how can you work with an organization that may not 100% believe in the same values that you believe in?
I think I'll just note, that there is a challenge in working in coalition and with different organizations that have different strategies and approaches and theories of change. Just as much as it is powerful to come together around an issue or a task. If it's local, it might be something that connects you in your neighborhood. It might be something that connects you like in your vicinity, or it might be a service that you're providing. Like there are ways in which you can develop relationships step by step, and then move into those deeper conversations around differences in strategy. I don't know if that's getting at what you're trying to address, but I think that it's a long process of walking with and asking questions and being curious and kind of taking the long haul in moving people to make change.
Thanks, Lida. Next question. So part of countering Islamophobia is making ourselves known and raising awareness about Islam and Muslims. Yet this person's found it challenging to mobilize the Muslim community to get involved in interfaith dialogue. Where is that resistance coming from, and how can they address it? Nina, this might be directed towards you.
Yeah, I guess I can answer some of the resistance part. I mean, I think that interfaith efforts are really, really great. And I think it's like one strategy, right? It's like the kind of empathy building or going into spaces, right? And I think that Muslims for the past few decades, and there's also segments of the Muslim community, like specifically if you're Black Muslim, my whole family is not Muslim and Christian. So like, I don't necessarily feel the need to explain my faith, like when my life is very interfaith, given what we connect. So there's going to be about a third of Muslims that are like, I already do that work on a day-to-day basis. I go to work and I do that. They understand, the theology, like Judeo-Christian theology, whether from like their family relations. So doing that work, but it's also like sometimes they may feel definitely disempowered when you're constantly engaging with people that deny your humanity or who are invested in misunderstanding you and deny like the legitimacy of you as like having a legitimate faith. And so I think that some people may actually feel burned by doing that kind of work or have some trepidation. I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for like some of the people that I know that do that kind of work. And what is more attractive to the people within who I organize with is doing multi-faith organizing, right? Where it's like, sometimes it doesn't always matter what you believe or your theology, but if we're fighting for the same common cause for dignity and justice and plurality, then we can move together. We move forward towards like shared policies of improving our community, rather than kind of going through the kind of like, I'm going to open my house to people who are okay with executive office that bans parts of my community simply for what we believe, right? And so those people like doing the multi-faith organizing or working towards countering oppression or improving community, and we build relationships from there. That's a lot more attractive to people that I organize with. That's by no means saying that interfaith work and dispelling misconceptions and lifting up truths and real world experiences, like those are all important aspects of doing the anti-oppression work. It's just some people may just be, kind of maybe tired from doing that and are looking for other strategies to do the systems change work to really increase the freedoms for Muslims, but for all citizens and all non-citizens in this country.
Totally. I want to jump in and just say, Dalia, were you about to speak?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll definitely wait. Yeah.
Sure. Just a couple of thoughts. One is multi-faith work, interfaith work, bridge building work. It's exhausting, and it's not for everyone, and it's a step back, step up kind of dance. Sometimes, and I think particularly with the Muslim community, it's a lot on a small percentage of people in the United States to expect them to do everything and to come to all the events and to exert energy in different ways. And so, naming that, it's a lot to expect, but then at the same time, I think it's a process of stepping up and stepping back. And also want to say that there are ways that we can do it by kind of seeing. So for example, I'll just share for one of Shoulder to Shoulder's campaigns. Every Ramadan, we uplift an interfaith or multi-faith iftar map in the United States. So in 2019, before the pandemic, there were 528 iftars in 38 states. And this is just at masjids, at community centers, and it's basically a chance to share a meal literally at a table set by Muslims. And many times in multi-faith spaces, interfaith spaces, it's predominantly Christian oriented. This is a chance to just share a meal, get to know folks in your neighborhood, and have the invitation be offered and given in a time. So that's just one example of kind of letting folks opt in and letting folks lead when the community is stretched thin.
Can I also just add one quick thing about that? When you look at the data on Muslims and on the degree to which they are involved in their community, it might feel like we're not doing enough or that there is resistance, but compared to all other faith communities, we are at least as engaged, if not more. So any statistic you can name, the percentage of Muslims who volunteer to help fix a problem in their neighborhood, that percentage is on par or higher than other faith communities. The number of Muslims make up 1% of the population, but half of Americans know a Muslim personally. That is, think about it, 50% of, and we always say most people don't know a Muslim, which is true, but it's actually 50% do know a Muslim, and 30% know a Muslim as a good friend, and we're 1% of the population. That means we are not isolating ourselves. Just the numbers are really clear. We're doing our best as a very tiny, under-resourced community, and it has to be the majority that does more. That's how we're gonna fix this. It's not more people, it's not more Muslims doing, more interfaith. That is important and helpful, but the systemic change is going to come from the majority. When the majority realizes this is a priority for them, it's not going to be us doing, one more church visit. So that's one thing I want to really put out there and be real clear about. But the second thing I want to point out is around interfaith work. And I think I grew up my whole life doing this kind of stuff, so I support it. But I think we have to be really cautious and aware of the kind of interfaith work we're doing, because we are doing a whole lot of outreach when we do it to suburban white churches and synagogues, and very little toward the Black church or to Latino churches. And it's clear in the data that there is a gap in the way that we're doing our outreach. So I think it's really important to think of interfaith as in a more diverse kind of inclusive way, where we're doing outreach not just to white churches, but to the churches and the synagogues and the temples that represent all of America.
Thank you so much for adding that. I know we're supposed to end in about a minute, so I just want to thank everyone for your questions, for your comments. We will send a follow-up email today or tomorrow. Hopefully those resources would be able to answer any questions that remained. But I want to especially thank our amazing panelists for joining us today and sharing their expertise and answering everyone's questions. I also want to thank our audience for sticking with us, again, with your comments and your questions. Your feedback is really important to us, and I think everyone received a pop-up window with a really quick evaluation. If you could just please fill that out. As mentioned, this toolkit is accessible for free on ISPU's website at ispu.org. You will again also receive that in the follow-up email. coming very shortly, and please spread it within your network. So we encourage you to continue to check the organizations represented here and the work that they do, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.